people have a real valid reason to be skeptical of capitalism.
Aaron Gray is the founder and CEO of Findhelp.org.
Especially in an age where we learn about every wrongdoing by a for-profit company with social media and things like that. I don't think there's a lot of people that are twisting their mustaches, intentionally doing these things. But either way, you can accept that what we have is imperfect. But what do? Do you burn it down? It's becoming very popular, especially over the last few years, and rightfully. But who suffers while the burning is happening? The poor people suffer more than they already are. So I don't have the answer, but what is the option that we have to move forward? And it's just slow. Public policy is slow, and we just have to keep fighting.
What is the option we have to move forward? And what roadmap do we have to keep fighting when compromise seems so far from possible? The New Deal put people back to work, restored faith in the American economic system, and revived a sense of hope in the American people.
But the accomplishments of the New Deal didn't come about without great compromise.
Roosevelt was always asking himself, what can I get through Congress?
You get a New Deal in the South that has a lot of benefits for a lot of people, but very carefully maintains these power relations.
It is so important that we look critically at this period.
This is American Compassion, the Safety Net podcast, a series devoted to telling the story of the safety net, governmental and not, in America. I'm Rebecca McEnroy.
I'm Michael Zapruder. This podcast tells the story behind the story of the American safety net, the story of those who had the vision, those who continued the vision, and the story of at least one man who is developing and expanding the vision into the 21st century and beyond.
In this episode, we'll get a sense of what the New Deal did for America. We'll talk about the compromises made in order to get the New Deal through Congress and adopted by the American people. And we explore who was left out of the New Deal because of those compromises and the legacy of those omissions to this day. Stay with us.
I think most people associate the New Deal with the makings of our modern welfare state. My name is Willow Lung Amam. I am an associate professor in the Urban Studies and Planning program. I am also Director of Community Development at the National Center for Smart Growth Research and Education. We're coming out of the Great Depression, which was the longest and largest economic slump in American history. It had lasted a decade. In the run-up to World War II, there was so much economic turmoil. And this was really the first time that the federal government had taken a really powerful role in providing a suite of programs that was really meant to provide a basic bottom line for Americans. And even the idea of the welfare state really coming out of that period. And so you see this alphabet soup of federal agencies that come to the fore that we now take for granted, like the FDIC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, a lot of public works happening during the time, youth being employed. So there is a sense that America is coming out of this long period of economic downturn, and really a great optimism over what that's going to look like.
And it created a bunch of important social programs that we still rely on today, like Social Security. I'm Tom Philpott. I'm the food and agriculture correspondent for Mother Jones and author of the book Perilous Bounty. The New Deal was a really important response to a bunch of catastrophic crises. Just imagine being an old person in the 30s when suddenly the economy goes bust, you have no income, the relatives that you're relying on suddenly are out of work too. And so it's just this disaster for the elderly. So Social Security comes in to solve that problem. You have pro-worker moves like the 40-hour work week, time and a half overtime.
It's the first time that you ever had a government stepping in a very significant way to use fiscal policy to mitigate the impact of an economic calamity like the Great Depression.
Marshall Auerbach is a market commentator and researcher.
Before that, it was always seen as something like a tornado. It hits you, there's nothing you could do about it, just suck it up and work your way through it. And it's something that you have to do as an individual or maybe with the help of your community. Certainly it's not something that the government is there to help you with. And there's almost a moral failing if you have to use any kind of aid other than yourself. It really engendered a very, very significant, almost revolutionary viewpoint.
This sense of taking care of things on your own, forging your own path and pulling yourself up from your bootstraps. This was a uniquely American ideal, and any new social program would have to take this into account. Americans hold this element of self-determination as sacred, and it's no small or new thing. So where does it come from?
That is a deep question, and it's a question that really goes to this difficult to quantify and difficult to be specific about, but nevertheless persistent characteristic of our national culture. My name is David Kennedy. I've taught history at Stanford University for many years. And what I know about this subject, I learned mostly in the course of writing a quite lengthy book called Freedom from Fear, the subtitle of which is The American People in Depression and War, 1929-1945. So a lot of the book concerns the New Deal period, of course, and the Great Depression, and the legislation and the institution building that came out of that period. And by way of answer, I'll go back a century before the New Deal and remind us all of the great Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville when he visited the United States in the 1830s. And he coined a word, which is now part of our common vocabulary, but he actually coined the word to describe what he thought to be the peculiar psychology of the American people, something he had never seen before, and he could not find evidence of it anywhere in the history books. He thought it was a defining characteristic of our national culture. And the word is individualism. And he distinguished individualism from selfishness or egotism. He said those are just standard characteristics of the human species. But American society has a different take on that, he argued. This is 200 years ago now that he's making this argument. There was a pervasive belief in American culture that we are all the captains of our own destiny and the masters of our own fate. We're all self-made people. And it doesn't take any village to raise us, by golly. He didn't put it that way, of course, but we are wholly responsible for our situation in life as individuals. And with certain modifications, I think that idea has persisted for 2 centuries, at least in our culture. That, I think, is the taproot that Roosevelt understood and recognized when he insisted that if this system were going to stay in place and be stable and be accepted by the country at large, it had to honor that kind of thinking. So, for example, when Frances Perkins first met with the Committee on Economic Security to give them their basic instructions about how to proceed and at what pace and so on and so forth, conveyed to them the president's wishes about what was to be accomplished, he said something, and she records in her memoir, and I can quote it actually. She said, "We hope they would make recommendations based upon a practical knowledge of the needs of our country." That's the volatility of the economy and the vulnerability to unemployment and so on, and all the hazards of old age. Practical knowledge of the needs of our country, the prejudices of our people, and our legislative habits. Very frank acknowledgement when she says the prejudices of our people. She tells them that in the very first planning session when the drafting team meets to go to work. That she wants them to be aware of the peculiarities of American culture, and that meant, among other things, that they had to devise a scheme on the private insurance model, not on the general welfare model.
But this idea of individualism was and is a myth. Americans couldn't achieve that idea of self-sufficiency without a safety net. The country needed a New Deal. Tom Philpott.
The New Deal recognizes that the private sector, when it controls the economy completely, creates a very unstable economy that's given to recurring crises.
My name is Mike Consul. I'm a director in the think tank at the Roosevelt Institute, where I run our macroeconomic analysis project. The New Deal rips open that nominally private sphere of the workplace and says we're going to try to extend, however tenuously, a basic amount of democracy and security through labor law, through unionization. That's very different from the basically feudal structure that existed in the workplace prior to the New Deal.
The New Deal was a way out of one of the darkest times in American history, the Great Depression.
A way out, yes, but not without trade-offs.
Again, David Kennedy.
The Social Security bill itself, in its early planning stages, had three components: old age pensions, unemployment insurance, and universal health care. So again, we're the only advanced industrial society on the planet that still does not have universal health care as a matter of government or public provision. And this controversy goes back at least as far as the 1930s, because Roosevelt very quickly figured out that if he insisted on universal health care, it would doom the entire bill, because there would be so much resistance to that. So early on, he told the committee to forget about universal health care, just concentrate on these other two aspects: old age pensions and unemployment insurance. So they go to work on the old age pensions and unemployment insurance. And again, to make a long and complicated story short, the unemployment insurance part of the bill is federalized. That is to say, the states are given pretty strong incentives to set up their own programs, but it is not, strictly speaking, a federal government responsibility. Old age pensions, on the other hand, remain a central government or federal government program and responsibility, and that's true to this day. Again, here in the very earliest stages of the drafting process of this bill, we see again the deference to what Frances Perkins called the prejudices of our people and our legislative habits. Roosevelt was looking for the least disruptive pathway to some kind of bill. And if he encumbered the bill with too aggressive number of items across the spectrum of social provision, including medical care, for example, he'd probably lose the whole thing. So it was a shrewd political calculation of what he could accomplish, even given the highly charged circumstances of the Great Depression of the 1930s. There were still constraints and limits on what could be done. And he calculated correctly. He got something done. He got something rather considerable done, but something rather less than he originally intended. No medical care, unemployment insurance with all kinds of variability across the country because it's the responsibility of individual states, and certain restrictions, in fact, on who was eligible for the old age pension part of Social Security. So this is where, again, to go back to that word that Frances Perkins used about the prejudices of our people, where we're really talking about different kinds of prejudices. We're talking about prejudices in the realm of economic theory and practice, and what was legitimate economically and fiscally and what was not. And then eventually we get into the much more common understanding of the word prejudice, where it has to do with racial and ethnic prejudice. That too figured in the actual birth circumstances of Social Security.
These compromises had big consequences, both positive and negative. When we return.
So Roosevelt was the ultimate pragmatist. Roosevelt was always asking himself, what can I get through Congress?
Roosevelt could have pushed to enfranchise Black people in the South.
What if FDR had done an end around and gone directly to Black voters and said, you will have the vote, let's make common cause? It is a very interesting counterfactual.
You're listening to American Compassion, the Safety Net podcast. I'm Michael Zapruder.
And I'm Rebecca McEnroy. Stay with us.
The New Deal was not a new deal for everybody.
You get a New Deal in the South that has a lot of benefits for a lot of people, but very carefully maintains these power relations in agriculture and in domestic labor.
Why is that the case? Well, it's because in the 1930s, when Franklin Roosevelt and his team were putting together what became the Social Security Act, they were terrified the Supreme Court was going to kill it.
There's so much that comes out of the New Deal that we have today that is so important. But it is also so important that we look critically at this period, especially as we look to it as a model for what is possible today.
Welcome to American Compassion, the podcast that tells the story of the past, present, and future of the American safety net. I'm Michael Zapruder.
And I'm Rebecca McEnroy. In order to get the New Deal policies through Congress, FDR had to make a lot of compromises.
These were the deals behind the New Deal, leading many to question FDR's motives. Mike Congsel.
FDR is a lot like Lincoln in the sense of both being very important, but also that a lot of people have a lot of different reads on how to understand him historically, and all are very complex.
It's important to note in the politics of all of this that probably 95% of the black population in America lived in the South. And that's crucial because of the Jim Crow system of segregation.
Historian H.W. Brands has authored over 30 books on American history, from the American Revolution to FDR to the Cold War and more.
The South was solidly Democratic, but those Southern Democrats were very conservative. So Roosevelt was the ultimate pragmatist. Roosevelt was always asking himself, what can I get through Congress? And when it came to the safety net, Social Security excluded farm workers. That's really critical. And Roosevelt wasn't thinking, okay, we're going to leave black people out of this. There were more farm workers in the country who weren't black than who were black. But the farm sector was being taken care of in other ways. So it wasn't part of Social Security, but there was the Agricultural Adjustment Act and administration, part of the first wave of the New Deal, the 100 Days. Roosevelt is very aware that his governing coalition consists of two pillars. There is essentially the urban pillar, and it includes immigrants and their descendants and the political bosses of the North and the Midwestern cities. And then it's all these white Southern Democrats, and they're very conservative. They are willing to tolerate the New Deal and Social Security, but they're not enthusiastic about it. And Roosevelt knows that if he pushes too far, he'll lose them. For example, this is not directly connected to the social safety net, but by the 1930s, lynching had been an epidemic problem, especially in the South, for 40 years. And it was very clear that state laws were not dealing with it, because state laws are administered by state judges, and most state judges are elected. And if you're going to get elected in the South, you're going to get elected by the white people, who are mostly the only people voting, and you're not going to get many convictions of people for lynching. So the only way of dealing with it was to pass a federal anti-lynching law. Eleanor Roosevelt thought this was a great idea, and Eleanor Roosevelt kept telling Franklin, you got to get behind this federal anti-lynching law. It's the only way to deal with this. And Roosevelt said, that's a great idea, but I can't do it, because I will blow up my coalition. The Southern conservatives, I need them. They control the Senate committees, because in the South they kept returning the same Democrats again and again, and the committees are governed by seniority. And so if I lose them, I lose the entire New Deal. So we'll leave the race question for later, but we're going to get what we can now. And so the Social Security Act, this is 1935, and the various other measures to deal with it, they tended to be focused on the urban poor. Again, I have to make a separate category for the Agricultural Adjustment Act. There was a separate farm bill. And it's important to note that for the next 80 years, a farm bill was a very different thing than, say, a welfare act. Now, in fact, the two were doing essentially the same thing, but for political reasons, this is kept in a separate accounting sheet. And it also allows the legislation to be focused. So if you got a farm bill, you got to focus on Kansas. But if you're talking about alleviating urban poverty, don't talk to Kansas. Except that if New York votes for Kansas, then Kansas will vote for New York when the time comes. And this is the way the Democratic politics worked during this time. It was important that neither side push so hard as to alienate the other side. In fact, this happens to Roosevelt. So in his second term as president, he starts to lose his hold on the South. And then when he tries to overcome rejection by the Supreme Court by proposing to increase the number of judges, so-called pack the court, then the South just says, we're out of here. And the New Deal dies at that point. At least there are no more new programs, and it's dead. And in fact, Roosevelt would have been dead in the water, except World War II comes along and allows him to run for a third term.
And that's just the beginning of the story of the complicated struggles for power in U.S. government.
Why did Southern Democratic congressmen, both in the House and the Senate, why did they have so much power? They didn't have power just because they were powerful. They had power because they disenfranchised black voters.
Robin D.G. Kelley is a professor of history at UCLA and has written extensively about the history of social movements in the U.S., the African diaspora, black intellectuals, and more. In the preface for the 25th anniversary edition of his book Hammer and Hoe, Kelley reflects on the impact of the New Deal in the South and what it can teach us today.
So think about politically, when the country was formed, black people couldn't vote initially, but they counted 3 out of 5 black people for congressional representation. That meant that the South already had more Congress people than they had population voting for them. When slavery ended, the 14th and 15th Amendment were passed, in Reconstruction, there was a moment when many black people in the South, black men, could vote. And in fact, there was a clause in the 14th Amendment saying that if you disenfranchise black people, we're going to reduce congressional representation. That's in the 14th Amendment. But what happens? Reconstruction is crushed. They go about their business, and something magical happens politically. And that is they disenfranchise 95% to 98% of the black community. So now, instead of having 3 out of 5 represented, they're counting 5 out of 5. They're counting 100% of the black population in the South for congressional representation, for financial support, for all the things that come with representation, and they can't vote. That meant that Southern senators and Southern congressmen were not only reelected constantly because there was no competing party, but it meant that they had more seniority because they were in office for much longer. More seniority meant that they controlled all those committees. So Roosevelt could have pushed to enfranchise black people in the South. Southern Democrats would have supported the New Deal anyway. They weren't opposed to it because they benefited, their constituency benefited. Not only that, but Southern Democrats, elected officials, and the class that supported them controlled the mechanisms of the New Deal.
I think there is a lot to that.
Tom Philpott.
What if instead of ceding everything to this white planter class in the South, what if FDR had done an end around and gone directly to black voters and said, you will have the vote, let's make common cause? It is a very interesting counterfactual. But you can't underestimate the viciousness of the racism and sense of entitlement that these Southern politicians and the sort of planter class of the South had going into the 40s. But I also think that, look, in the late 50s and going into the 60s, the federal government intervened in the South. The National Guard came to help to segregate various schools. And to go back to Robin D.G. Kelley's point, what was stopping FDR from doing that? I mean, I think it could have really sped up the civil rights movement. It would have taken a mass mobilization on the ground in the South of black people and white allies, but that happened not that long after that. So maybe he could have forced that battle a lot quicker than it happened. It's really hard to say, but I can tell you that the backlash would have been violent, as it was when it played out. So yeah, it was going to be a battle no matter what.
As Tom mentions, it would have taken mass mobilization of African Americans in the South, along with white allies, to push FDR in a different direction. And even though the New Deal did not confront racism head-on, Did it make way for a stronger labor movement in the U.S.? One that could unite towards such a common cause? Again, Robin D.G. Kelley.
After 1935, the American Federation of Labor decided, you know what, we're going to do a nationwide campaign to organize industrial workers. So after 1935, by 1936, a lot of the radical organizations who formed these unions, those leaders entered the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and became leaders there. And they began to organize on this large scale. And they extended way beyond just unionizing. The CIO in the South formed things like right-to-vote clubs, where they were convincing the union to support enfranchisement for black workers, which was a huge thing. With federal support, with the National Industrial Recovery Administration, or NIRA, and then later with the Wagner Act, which was an even more robust piece of pro-labor legislation in 1935 under the New Deal, that this legislation made it difficult for states to pass right-to-work laws. And this was like kind of the heyday for a minute of union organizing, which strengthened the working class. And that, more than the New Deal itself, the presence of a strong union ensured at least a decent wage alongside a welfare state that provided unemployment insurance, Social Security, and other things. That is the social safety net.
It was crucial that labor organizers had allies in government, and one of their fiercest allies was FDR's Labor Secretary Frances Perkins. Her vision found concrete expression in such landmark reforms as the Wagner Act that Robin D.G. Kelley mentioned, which gave workers the right to organize unions and bargain collectively, and the Fair Labor Standards Act, which established for the first time a minimum wage and a maximum work week for men and women. Perkins also chaired the Committee on Economic Security, which developed and drafted the legislation that became the Social Security Act. When considering who was left out of the New Deal, where we are today can overshadow how horrifying working conditions were before such labor laws were enacted. And it's important to remember that there were people like Frances Perkins working tirelessly on reform. And although she didn't get everything she wanted, she remained fixed.
Her focus is working people.
Penny Coleman is the author of A Woman Unafraid, The Achievements of Frances Perkins.
She had a very strong focus on men and women who are working in canneries, 6-year-old children who are shelling peas, and workers in Pittsburgh in the massive iron-producing, steel-producing factories, people out in fields, people who are working really hard, dangerous jobs for very long hours and minimal pay, people who work with toxic chemicals like lead and end up dying. Immigrants, she's very much concerned about immigrants. Early in her life, she works in Philadelphia for an agency to protect immigrants and young women, particularly African-American women who were coming up from the South looking for work, who would then be met by all sorts of unscrupulous people.
And it wasn't enough for Frances Perkins to give workers rights. She wanted to elevate the quality of life for all Americans.
On August 1933, she's on the cover of Time magazine, and underneath she's quoted as saying, "It's time that we treat ourselves to some civilization." And civilization for Frances Perkins meant, for example, working people should have enough money and enough time that they can sit in a park and read a book. And she has this concept of civility, and that even though workers are on strike, you need to listen to them. You need to negotiate with them. And she has a profound sense that in a country as rich as America, there should not be unemployment, poverty, hunger. For Frances Perkins, and it was the role of government to provide for those needs. It was the role of government to provide workmen's compensation, unemployment, and of course, Social Security, which is her defining legacy. But also she advocated and got minimum wage, reduced hours for women and children, eradicated child labor. That for her was what it meant to be civilized.
When we understand her grand vision for what life could be like in America, we get a better sense of why she saw the New Deal as a few flat-footed first steps. Yet, like she said, she would rather have a half a loaf than nothing at all. And that half a loaf was significant. David Kennedy.
The New Deal did more to change the landscape of American life than any administration before it, with the exception of Abraham Lincoln, and any administration after it, with the exception of Lyndon Johnson. So I think we need to understand the scale and quality of that achievement, even while recognizing that it had limits, that we don't live in a utopian world where all of our aspirations can be fulfilled if we just apply ourselves assiduously enough. So there are very specific institutional reasons why the New Deal was not more aggressive with respect to the issue of racial equality. Roosevelt's room for maneuver in that respect to the Congress in particular was really pretty well constrained by that. In the congressional elections cycle of 1938, he actually campaigned in the South against some of the most notorious conservatives and segregationists. And he got nowhere. He managed to change nobody's seat or oust anybody that he wanted to get rid of. Again, an example of the limits of even his considerable political power. It's regrettable. I'm not trying to defend it at all, but I'm just trying to explain it, that even Roosevelt, even in that circumstance, did not have the power to accomplish everything that he wanted to. The evidence is mixed or thin, let's say, about how much he really wanted to change the character of the South. There's some evidence that he understood racial inequality as a problem and wanted to address it. I'm reminded here of a remark many years later by Andrew Young, former mayor of Atlanta and pastor of the United Nations and an associate of Martin Luther King Jr.'s. Andrew Young once said that the modern civil rights movement, that is the civil rights movement that we know a lot about in the 1950s and 60s, began with the Tennessee Valley Authority Act in 1933. Why? Because that was the first instance of federal investment in the modernization of the South since Reconstruction. For 60 or 70 years, the federal government had not bestirred itself in any meaningful way to try to bring the South into the modern world. Tennessee Valley Authority did, and in Andrew Young's view, at least, that was the place where we should date the origins of the modern civil rights movement. So it's, again, another piece of evidence about Roosevelt doing what he could, but working within the kinds of constraints that faced him.
But for those who got merely a crumb from that half a loaf, the effects were felt deeply. When we return,
when the federal government sent checks out, they'd send them to the landlord and trust that the landlord would divide the money up.
And so you get this systematic destruction of Black farmers.
The Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, is the first government agency that is associated with what we now call redlining.
You're listening to American Compassion, the Safety Net podcast. I'm Michael Zapruder.
And I'm Rebecca McEnroy. Stay with us. Welcome back to American Compassion, the podcast that tells the story of the past, present, and future of the American safety net. I'm Rebecca McEnroy.
And I'm Michael Zapruder. It's easy to talk about who was left out of the New Deal.
And we can speculate as to why FDR made the choices he did and what he could have done otherwise.
But the results of the compromises and the way the programs were administered have had lasting consequences on some of the most vulnerable. Again, Robin D.G. Kelly.
Okay, so let's step back. What is the New Deal in the South? What does it look like? And how does it affect the lives of working people, Black, white, and other? The New Deal was an attempt to save capitalism in the face of a global crisis. And one of the things they wanted to do was to maintain price stability of agricultural goods. So the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was national but had a particular sort of valence in the South, was a way to subsidize farmers by giving them money first to destroy crops, like to destroy cotton, to kill pigs, in order to keep the prices of commodities high, not to redistribute food, not to take those pigs that we're going to give them away so people could eat, but to destroy them, right, to keep the prices high so you wouldn't have a collapse in price. Secondly, they would pay these subsidies to farmers, and they would give the check to a farmer. So what does a farmer look like in the South? Well, you had a system of sharecropping where you had landlords who owned maybe 400, 500 acres of land and divided that land up into parcels. Black and poor white tenant farmers would rent that land, and they would produce crops, and they would allegedly share, but basically they were just being ripped off. The landlord would advance them food, seeds, some other things, and they have to like rent draft animals, things like that. They would advance them in the wintertime, and they would be in debt. They would grow their cotton crop, whatever crop they're growing, tobacco, and then at the end of the harvest, they would then settle accounts. And in every single case, by the end of the settling of accounts, the black sharecroppers and some poor white tenant farmers would be in debt. Now, how does this relate to the Agricultural Adjustment Act? Well, when the federal government sent checks out, they'd send them to the landlord and trust that the landlord would divide the money up, right? Divide the money up with the sharecroppers. But that didn't happen. What the landlord did was pocket the money, and often, at least the visionary ones, you use that money to purchase labor-saving devices like mechanical cotton pickers. And they would invest that in ways that would lead to the dispossession, or the eviction, I should say, of tenant farmers and sharecroppers, who then would have to come back as agricultural laborers. So the New Deal facilitated the eviction and immiseration and poverty of poor black people and enriched the landlord.
And then there's this other story about the New Deal and agriculture slowing down this boom and bust cycle on farms.
Tom Philpott.
Where you get massive overproduction and prices tumble and farms go out of business, and then prices rise again and farmers overinvest and start to ramp up production, and food becomes expensive for consumers, and then farmers catch up and overshoot, and you get another bust. And this had been happening in American agriculture for quite a long time. And the New Deal made a bunch of provisions to try to stop that. They implemented something called supply management, and that is where the government tries to figure out, okay, how much acreage of wheat do we need? How much acreage of corn or soybeans or oats? And let's try to manage that to try to soften these price extremes. And they also had grain storage systems. And so when there's too much of something like wheat and the prices are about to plummet and put farmers out of business, the government buys some of that wheat and stores it. And next time there's a shortage, the government releases that, benefits consumers because the price never gets too high, and benefits farmers because the price never gets too low. That's one of the things that the New Deal did. And in some ways, it was a successful program. But there was this other thing happening, and that was the industrialization of agriculture. And the same agency that oversaw this supply management, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, also put in policies that really ramped up the industrialization of agriculture. They gave a whole bunch of loans to farmers, and they showered them with research and subsidies. And the idea was you need to buy a bigger tractor, you need to buy a bigger combine harvester, you need to start paying for these more expensive hybrid seeds that you can't save, and you have to buy them every year, but they're way more productive. You got to buy fertilizers that we've developed that came out of our bomb-making factories, and now we're repurposing those factories to make fertilizer instead, and we'll loan you money to buy them. Same with pesticides. These grow out of the military as well, and they offer a way for farmers to control weeds and insects. and it's expensive, but we're going to loan you money for that. And so they sort of bombard farm country with these loans and programs, and U.S. agriculture explodes in productivity. You get ever bigger harvests of corn and soybeans and wheat and cotton. But there was just one exception. They systematically left out Black farmers from these programs. The programs tended to be administered at the county level. And if you're a rural county in Georgia, there was a set of commissioners voted in, dominated by white farmers. And Black farmers, by the 1920s, despite the evisceration of Reconstruction, had gotten a foothold on American farmland and had substantial holdings in farmland. And so when the USDA starts pushing this industrialization and production skyrockets and prices for stuff like corn and soybeans and wheat drop, and cotton as well, white farmers are able to stay afloat despite the lower prices because they're getting all this USDA support, and Black farmers aren't. And so you get this systematic destruction of Black farmers with the USDA in the driver's seat. It starts around the 40s and basically continues to this day. Black Americans in 2022 own about 5% of the land that they owned in 1922. This is farmland. And that act, it has this wave effect because if you're a Black family that had 100 acres of farmland in Georgia and not allowed to get these loans, the prices are really low, you're producing less than your peers, and you couldn't pay your bills anymore, couldn't pay your taxes, and so you had to sell the farmland. And you probably sold it to a white person. So it was this transfer of land from Black Americans to white Americans. So all of a sudden, you've lost this asset. And it's an asset, this 100 acres of farmland that is now not in the family. That 100 acres developed a lot of value in the next 50 years. That's money that you couldn't take a loan out against and send your kid to college. It's money that you couldn't buy a house with, so you had to rent. And by being kicked out of the housing market, you were kicked out of another massive source of American wealth. So what you get here is basically this ruination of Black agriculturalists in the South. And so these are all consequences of the unequal way that the New Deal was administered.
But the inequities were not limited to rural America. Black people in cities and suburbs had their own unique interactions with governmental agencies set up through the New Deal. Willow Lung Amam.
One of those alphabet soup government agencies that was created during the New Deal was the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which later transformed into the Federal Housing Administration. And this was seen as a critical way of the federal government, really for the first time, being involved in helping to provide homes for Americans. Prior to this period, you had no federal loan guarantee. Loans were just given out by private banks without any kind of security on default of those loans, which made lenders pretty conservative in terms of who they would lend to and the terms of those loans, which wasn't making housing widely available to many Americans. So there were relatively few Americans that were able to own homes because they were not able to afford the down payment. It was a pretty short term for repayment of those loans, charged pretty high interest rates, pretty difficult terms for most families to manage. So home ownership was not widely available to the vast majority of Americans. And so the Homeowners Loan Corporation, later FHA, provided this federal mortgage guarantee. But one of the things that they also did when they provided this mortgage guarantee was create a system that associated homeownership for Black Americans with risk. And so the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, is the first government agency that is associated with what we now call redlining, where they would literally create maps that marked Black neighborhoods and other neighborhoods where Black people lived, so mixed neighborhoods, with a red pen and said, these are risky neighborhoods. These are risky investments. And so we're seeing from the government agency perspective a notion of race and risk tied to property. Those maps were then later adopted by the Federal Housing Administration and then by private banks to determine where they were going to lend FHA loans, which were providing much better terms for lending, extending loans out to 30-year loans, lowering interest rates to 10% or less, lowering the down payment for these properties from 25% to less than 10% for your initial down payment for first-time home buyers. So really laying the groundwork for this nation of property owners, but who were not able to own properties because they were not given FHA loans, or who was excluded from this, were largely Black homeowners and homeowners of color more broadly.
When you add the two things up, when you add the exclusion from farmland ownership and then home ownership, what you get is a recipe for a massive, gaping racial wealth gap, which exists to this day.
When considering the overwhelming impact the New Deal has had on American society, both bad and good, it's easy to criticize it or adore it beyond critique. It's harder to see how this revolution of American compassion was, as Frances Perkins noted, merely a few flat-footed first steps.
David Kennedy.
Life is a matter of compromises. All aspects of life are a matter of trade-offs and compromises. And that is certainly true in the political realm, that no leader anywhere, anytime has ever got everything he or she wanted to accomplish, particularly in a society as big and complicated and diverse as ours. Any proposition for significant change or improvement or whatever is always contested by all the many, many parties who think they have an interest in it. So in some ways, my colleague at Stanford, Frank Fukuyama, says we have a system that could be described as a veto-ocracy. There are so many places in the system where somebody can gum up the works and block initiatives. And sometimes I think that given the system we have, it's a wonder we get anything accomplished at all. Compromise is very, very difficult in a society as large and diverse as ours, and as historically undisposed toward collective action.
Mike Congsel.
When programs are being created now, the actual distribution and the full equitableness of it at the time of creation should be highlighted and understood. I think a thing to learn is advocating and pushing policy at the level of the problem. FDR went in not to take the edge off the Great Depression, but to solve it and finish it. And he did that. You know, the absolute abysmal state of social insurance, which for all purposes did not exist, and getting that key piece in place that could be built upon, that was solid enough, was very important. So thinking about addressing challenges at the right size and thinking about things that can be built on and expanded as our world changes, I think is very key.
Solid is a good word for the New Deal, solidifying the American safety net. But the story doesn't end there. H.W. Brands.
So the social safety net, as it is created in the 1930s, gets deeper and broader during the 1940s and 1950s. Here in the 1940s, the driving force is not any sort of new ideas, but World War II. What World War II demonstrated was that government can be a force for good in the world. And if you think about how people think about, now we're talking about a government-supplied safety net, you're going to be much more favorably inclined toward it if you think that government works. If you think government always screws up, then you say, well, no, let's not do it that way. And government has never worked better for the people of the United States than in World War II. Because in 3.5 years, the government of the United States led this movement that destroyed fascism and secured democracy. And as part of the war effort, government did things it had never done before. It built housing for workers because there were ship plants in places like Vanport, Oregon, near Portland. And there wasn't any housing, but they needed the workers, so the government built the housing. And government supplied health care for workers because nobody else was providing it. And so government during World War II nationalized, essentially took over and ran large portions of the economy. And the economy boomed during the war as it had never boomed before. So at the end of the war in 1945, people looked and said, yeah, government does pretty good things. Another thing that happened is, and this happens all the time with aspects of a social safety net, and that is it's relatively easy to oppose a social safety net before it exists because there is no constituency that is defending something. But once it exists, then it is a whole lot harder to get rid of than it would have been to keep it from happening in the first place, because all of a sudden there are people who've built their life expectations around this. Social Security was created in 1935, but people did not start receiving pension checks until 1940. So during that first 5 years, the Social Security system, the whole idea, would have been politically vulnerable. But it survived, and it survived partly because of World War II, and Roosevelt could be elected a third time. From that point on, there are millions of people who are getting a Social Security check every month. And once that happens, you're never going to take it away. So the Republicans had not controlled the White House from 1932 to 1952. There were some Republicans who said, once we get back in the White House, once we get control again, we're going to erase Social Security. So Dwight Eisenhower gets elected in 1952, and some of these old-line conservatives come in and said, here's our chance. We're going to take down Social Security, and said, you're absolutely nuts. We can't do this. If we try, we're going to be driven into the political wilderness, and we will deserve our exile. And he wouldn't have anything to do with it. In fact, under Eisenhower, who was a relatively conservative individual, he was a Republican, Social Security broadened, and more people were brought in, because when Social Security was first created, it was targeted just sort of the most obvious groups, but it left out a lot of groups. So one of the things that LBJ did was he observed what the New Deal and what Roosevelt's legislation had done, but he also was aware of what it had not done. And it was crucial for this that Johnson was from Texas. If you had to summarize Johnson's approach to social legislation, it was to complete the New Deal. Johnson understood that Franklin Roosevelt had originally included health insurance in the original Social Security bill, but he realized, that's going to get the doctors upset, and I'm going to have a hard enough time pushing this through right now. So he took that off. And LBJ said, we got to put it back on. Actually, Harry Truman had tried to do it, but couldn't get enough traction. But LBJ, after his landslide victory in 1964, says, this is what we're going to do. And that gives rise to Medicare and Medicaid. So government support for medical insurance. Now, crucially, it's not comprehensive. It's comprehensive for old people, so if you're over 65, and it's for poor people under 65, but it's not health insurance for everybody. And so even then, Johnson understood that probably can't go that far. And for much of the same reason, that the medical lobby, for its own interest, but also for very good reasons, said, we got a really good healthcare system here. Don't screw it up and make it look like Britain's healthcare system, where everybody works for the government. We don't want to work for the government. So to summarize Johnson's philosophy on this score, it was very much this way. Now for Johnson, it had to start with things like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, because he had to get rid of the Jim Crow system that made essentially black people in the South victims of a kind of apartheid. And that was the essential part. But what Johnson always thought was the third leg of his stool of civil rights was the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which made sure that people could not be discriminated against in housing on the basis of their race.
Coming up in Season 2 of American Compassion.
When you talk of the safety net, you talk about Medicare, you talk about Social Security, you have to talk about a lot of other things that government did.
My fellow Americans, I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
in Season 2 of American Compassion. We'll go deep into not only the Civil Rights Act, but the man behind rural electrification, Medicare, Medicaid, the Great Society, and much more.
What we're discovering is that the history of the safety net is the history of who we are as Americans.
Why we think the way we think.
Why we feel some people are deserving of government help,
while others are sponging off the system.
It's a complicated,
at times confusing,
and ultimately very revealing,
critical story we all need to know.
American Compassion, the Safety Net podcast, is produced in Austin, Texas, with support from Findhelp.org.
Michael Zapruder composed and arranged the music for this show, and it was recorded live with Brandon Temple on drums, Sam Littman on piano, Rick White trumpet, and John Lundbaum banjo, and engineered by Jake Perlman and Renee Chavez.
Special thanks to our guests for this episode:
Mike Consul, Willow Lung Amon, and Tom Philpott.
Aaron Gray, H.W. Brands, Robin D.G. Kelly, and Marshall Auerbach.
Penny Coleman and David Kennedy.
Rebecca McEnroy is our executive producer. And for American Compassion, I'm Michael Zapruder. Thanks for listening.